The ladle clattered against the iron pot as Clara Whitlock jerked it too hard, broth splashing across the stove. Boots thudded on the floorboard behind her, men filing in from the dust-choked yard, laughter booming, spurs jingling. The scent of sweat, leather, and horses filled the narrow room, mixing with the heavy steam of beef stew and cornbread. "Ma'am, you got hands like clockwork." One ranch hand drawled, slapping his hat against his thigh before hanging it on a peg. Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't look up. She poured stew into tin bowls, set them down, and the men grabbed at them with the hunger of wolves. Their voices rose in a rough chorus, spoons clanking, chairs scraping, boots tapping restless beats against the worn floorboards. The screen door banged. A rush of hot desert air swept through, carrying grit that scratched across the table. Every head turned. A stranger stepped inside, tall and weather-beaten, shadows stretching across the kitchen floor. His coat was travel-stained, dust crusted at the hem. His hat pulled low so only the gleam of his eyes cut through the dim. No word passed between him and the man. Their chatter dulled to a low murmur, a thread of unease twisting the air. He removed his hat with a slow, deliberate motion, then set it on the hook beside the door. Clara felt her hand stilling over the ladle. Heat from the stove pressed against her back, but a different heat crawled across her skin. She forced herself to ladle another portion, the iron scraping the pot. The stranger moved to the end of the table, sat without asking, and waited. His posture was quiet, steady, but something that made the others glance his way, then back at their bowls. One by one, they dropped their eyes, spoons suddenly louder against the tin. Clara placed the bowl before him. Their eyes met, hers wary, his unreadable, sharp as flint yet softened by something unspoken. For a breath, the rattle of spoons, the low hum of talk, even the creak of the floorboards seemed to vanish. A ranch hand cleared his throat. "Ain't seen you on this stretch before." The stranger dipped his spoon, tasted, and answered with silence. Another hand laughed, brittle in the thick air. Must be passing through. But Clara caught the way his gaze shifted, past the men, past the table, toward the window where the land stretched wide and empty. His eyes lingered there, not as a drifter's would, but as if measuring something already his. The stew bubbled. The men muttered. The stranger ate slow, deliberate, each motion a ripple against the tense quiet. Clara turned back to the stove, but her hand trembled against the handle of the pot. She knew it then. This was no ordinary drifter. The kitchen, once filled with familiar clatter, now carried a silence sharp enough to cut. And still, the stranger said nothing. The lantern light swung, throwing long shadows across the bunkhouse walls. A drunken laugh broke through the air, harsh and unsteady. Clara's hand froze mid-wipe on the long pine table, her rag dripping water onto the floorboards. "Come on now, widow." A ranch hand slurred, leaning too close, his boots grinding against the floor. The sour smell of whiskey rolled off him. His hand reached out, fingers rough with callus. Before Clara could step back, the stranger moved, a blur of dust-colored coat, the scrape of a chair shoved hard against the wall. His hand clamped the drunk's wrist with iron precision. No wasted motion, no flare of anger, just a grip steady as steel. The ranch hand winced, tried to pull free, but the stranger's fingers tightened until the bone groaned. "That's enough," he said, voice low. The sound of stone dragged across gravel. The bunkhouse stilled. Cards froze mid-hand. Dice lay forgotten on the table, and every man's eyes fixed on the scene. Clara's heart hammered, rag twisting in her fist, though her face betrayed nothing. The drunk stumbled back when released, clutching his wrist, muttering curses under his breath. The stranger didn't look at him again. He turned, silent, and returned to his place by the wall, shadows swallowing him whole. Outside, a coyote howled, lonely and sharp. Clara's hand moved again, wiping the table, though her breath came shallow. When she dared glance his way, she found his gaze already on her, calm but unrelenting, as though weighing her words before she ever spoke them. She turned back to her rag, heat rising in her chest. The days that followed carried the weight of that silence. At dawn, the stranger rode with the men to mend fences, his movements deliberate, measured. He swung a hammer with the same precision he'd shown, gripping the drunk's wrist, strong, efficient, controlled. Yet when pay was handed out, he waved it aside. Evenings brought him back to the table, eating without hurry, always apart, always watchful. The men spoke less when he was near, their laughter dimmed, their stories cut short. One night, as Clara ladled stew, she caught him watching her hands. "What keeps you here, cooking for men who ain't your kin?" His voice was quiet, but it carried through the room. She kept her eyes on the bowl, the steam rising into her face. "This kitchen's the last piece of me left. I guard it same as I'd guard a child." The spoon dipped into silence. The men shifted, uneasy. The stranger's gaze lingered, unreadable, before dropping to his meal again. Later, long after the lamps were dimmed, Clara passed a window. A storm grumbled in the distance, lightning carving jagged scars across the dark. The stranger stood by the corral, still as a post, watching the horizon as though waiting for what the storm might carry. And the wind whispered through the yard like a warning. The hoofbeats shook dust from the rafters before the men even appeared. Clara gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, as a line of riders pushed through the yard, coats snapping in the wind. Their horses snorted, eyes rolling, the smell of sweat, and iron drifting through the open door. The first rider swung down, boots striking the ground like a hammer. His hat brim shadowed a sneer as he stepped into the kitchen, spurs biting sharp into floorboards. "This land's wasted on cowhands and widows," he said, voice thick with disdain. "Sell, or you'll be shoved off it." The ranch hands rose from the benches, shoulders tense, but none drew. Their eyes flicked to the stranger at the far wall. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Clara's rag slipped from her hand. She straightened, apron streaked with flour, and faced the intruder. Her voice was steady, low, carrying like a rifle shot through the silence. "This land's fed men longer than your greed's been alive." The rider laughed, ugly and loud, and reached for the pistol at his hip. The sound of leather creaking filled the air. In the same breath, the stranger stepped forward. His coat shifted, his hand blurred, faster than sight. A single crack split the air, sharp as thunder. The rider's pistol clattered to the floor, his hand hanging useless at his side, wrist bloody but whole. Silence pressed heavy. The other riders shifted uneasily, their bravado cracking. One spat in the dust. "This ain't over. We'll be back, and next time it won't be words." Boots pounded, hooves thundered, and the gang disappeared into the horizon's haze, leaving the yard broken with silence and grit. The ranch hands muttered low, fear seeping into their voices. "They'll bring more guns. We ain't got the firepower." Clara stood still, her breath ragged, but her spine unbent. She looked at the stranger. His gun was already holstered, his face unreadable, calm as if the shot had cost him nothing. That night, the lamps burned low. Clara sat at the table long after the hands had gone, her fingers clutching the wooden edge as if it might splinter under her grip. The stranger stood in the doorway, the storm outside flashing light across his face. "They'll come back," she whispered, not looking at him. "Yes." His voice was flat, certain. She closed her eyes, her chest tight with a fear she would not let them see. "I lost one man to gunfire. I don't want to watch another fall." He stepped closer, the stormlight flickering in his eyes. "I once killed for money, swore never again. But some things," he paused, voice rough, almost breaking, "some people are worth standing for." The thunder rolled over the plains, long and low. Clara pressed her hand to her mouth, silent, her heart pounding against the ache of memory. Outside, the stranger saddled his horse at dawn. The yard was quiet, but the horizon waited, dark with dust and coming violence. The sun burned straight overhead, bleaching the dust in the street to a blinding white. Heat shimmered in waves, bending the horizon, as the land barons' riders fanned out, their horses stamping, nostrils flaring. A dozen guns glinted beneath the glare, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The saloon doors creaked once, twice, before falling still. Windows cracked open, faces half-hidden, eyes wide. A mutter rippled along the boardwalk as townsfolk pressed back against the shadows. Boot steps echoed steady on the boards. The stranger stepped into the street, coat brushing the dust, hat brim low against the sun. His hands hung loose at his sides, fingers still, shoulders square. He stood alone, one man against many. A voice rose from the baron's ranks, oily and mocking. This the ghost who thinks he can stand in our way? The stranger's head lifted, his eyes cut sharp as flint, and his voice carried clear. This land's mine. Always was. A stir moved through the crowd. Murmurs swelled. Ranch hands, townsfolk, all leaning close. Clara's breath caught in her chest. She stepped from the boardwalk, skirts trailing the dust, her boots crunching sharp. Gasps followed her, but she did not falter. She took her place at his side. The baron spat into the dirt. A widow's courage don't win a war. His hand brushed the butt of his pistol. Clara's voice cut through the heat, hard and unwavering. This land belongs to him, and to every man who's worked it. But it breathes because of me. You'll take it only over my body. The riders shifted, unease crackling like dry brush before fire. The stranger's eyes never left the baron. His hand twitched once, then stilled again. A silence deeper than prayer fell over the street. Even the horses grew restless, stamping and blowing. Then the draw came, sudden, violent. Guns flashed, the air split with thunder. The stranger's hand blurred faster than sight. 3 shots cracked like lightning, clean and sharp, the sound rolling to the canyon streets. Dust jumped from the ground. A pistol spun from a gunman's hand. Another man's hat tore clean through. Horses reared, riders cursed. The baron's face drained pale. He yanked his reins, spurring hard, bolting from the street. His men broke with him, scattering in a storm of hooves, dust rising high enough to choke the sun. Silence rushed back in, heavy, absolute. The smoke drifted on the hot wind, curling between the two who still stood in the street. Clara's breath trembled, her hand pressed flat against her chest. She looked at the stranger. No, the rancher, the rightful owner. His gun rested steady in its holster, his shoulders rising once, then falling, calm as if death had brushed past and gone. The townsfolk stepped out, voices hushed, all heavy on their tongues. Some said later the land itself seemed to exhale relief. Clara only knew the truth. Her grief had ended here, not in silence, but in fire. And beside her stood the man who owned not just a ranch, but her heart.